Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this series of webinars that will focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm Dr. Denise Martinez, the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Carver College of Medicine and an Associate Professor in Family Medicine. The goal of this series is to learn, reflect, and think about one's own ability to impact equity in your life and also here in your role at UI Healthcare. This webinar is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. We appreciate you taking the time to learn more so that we can make UI Healthcare a more diverse, equitable, and welcoming environment for all.
Hi, my name is Monique Galpin. I work in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm an Administrative Services Coordinator, and I coordinate the SHPEP program, which is the Summer Health Professions Education Program. That is a pipeline program for undergraduate, underrepresented students who would like to pursue the health professions, whether that's medicine, dentistry, pharmacy, or public health. Another part of my role is community engagement, so I get to do educational outreach with Dr. David Moser.
Hi, I'm Dr. David Moser. I'm a neuropsychologist in psychiatry, but I also do a lot of educational outreach through our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Monique and I are happy to have the opportunity to talk with you all today. So often we see things happen either in the workplace or out in the community that just aren't quite right, or maybe sometimes we experience mistreatment ourselves. And too often we go home and think, oh, I really wish I could have done something, rather than trying to stay neutral or stay uninvolved. And today, Monique and I hope to talk with you a little bit and tell you about some tools that you can use so that you can intervene effectively when you see things like that happen. Monique's going to start us off by defining some of the terms that we'll be using in today's presentation.
So our first term is silent collusion. And silent collusion, as it implies, is being complicit by staying silent. So you might see an action happening to someone, you might see them being mistreated, but when you're not compelled to speak up, that can be perceived as being in collusion with what is taking place. When you are in collusion with what is taking place, you can be perceived as a bystander. So a bystander is someone who is present but not involved. When you become an upstander, that is a person who speaks or acts in support of an individual or cause, particularly someone who intervenes on behalf of a person being attacked or bullied. The situations that we're going to be presenting are called microaggressions. So this is a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or unintentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. Sometimes the term microaggression can seem like it's minimizing what is taking place, but I liken it to a paper cut. Something that might not necessarily kill you, but if you experience enough of them, it becomes painful enough and prevalent enough that it becomes a bother. So we're going to provide you with some situations of microaggressions and ways that you might become an upstander.
Some of the scenarios that we're about to present also may involve behaviors that are actually more than microaggressions and actually involve some explicitly offensive behaviors. One of the things we'd like you to keep in mind as you see these, or as you learn about these scenarios that we're going to present, is that these are not things that are taken out of textbooks. These are things that happened here, and we have fictionalized them slightly just to protect the identity of the people involved. But these are things that actually do happen here, and unfortunately happen quite a bit. And what we'd like you to do in each scenario that we present is to ask yourself a few questions. The first question is, what's going on here? The second question is, how would I feel if that were happening to me? And the third question is, what might I be able to do either in the moment or later on to be supportive to the person that's being targeted by these behaviors? And Monique, I think you're going to start us off by reading the first scenario. Is that right?
Yes, correct. A Black female administrative assistant who previously had short hair comes into work one morning with long braids. She receives some compliments on her new hairstyle, but also intrusive questions about how it grew so fast and if it is hers. That afternoon, an older white male faculty member reaches out and touches it. He also says in a joking tone, "Does this make you uncomfortable?" Shocked, she says no, but is visibly upset. So, Dave, what's going on here? What are some of the things that are happening?
Yeah, this is a tough one. There's an awful lot going on in this scenario. I mean, I think first of all, unwanted touching, reaching out and touching a coworker, clearly something that's not typically going to be okay. And I think one of the things to think about here is the different layers of power differential that are going on. This colleague, or this person that's reaching out and touching this person's hair is an older, more senior coworker. They're male. There's racial dynamics going on here. There's a lot in this scenario that would make it difficult, I think, for this person who's being treated like this to be able to speak up on her own behalf. Sometimes when we give these talks, people will say, like, what, we're not even allowed to compliment each other's hair anymore? And of course, a quick compliment like, hey, your hair looks great. Something like that is almost always going to be just fine. But some of the comments that were made here in this scenario were a little snarky. Hey, is that your hair? How'd it grow so fast? I mean, sort of intrusive and snarky comments. And then obviously this person goes way over the line by reaching out and touching this person's hair. That might be a surprise to some of you how frequently this happens, and it particularly happens frequently to African American individuals, that people will feel like it's just fair game to reach out and touch their hair. And in addition to the crossing of the social boundary and reaching out and touching them, there are additional things to think about there. For many Black individuals, hair and hairstyle is part of cultural identity and carries far more cultural significance than it would for many other individuals. So for a number of reasons, this particular person's behavior is highly offensive. Monique, what do you think a person who witnesses this might be able to do either in the moment or later in order to be supportive of the woman this happened to?
One of the things they might do is just acknowledge that something uncomfortable happened. Although the individual in this instance said that they weren't uncomfortable, you can tell by their physical reaction. So if you have a moment, maybe check in with that person, ask them how they felt, and also state that it made you uncomfortable. So that's something that you can do just to check in with them, because that's a lonely feeling when you have something happen to you, but it isn't acknowledged. So that's one way that you can intervene. Also in that moment, if you are able to, you can say that in front of the person who was reaching out and touching the hair, that that's something that made you uncomfortable. So sometimes that shifts that onus off of the person who was on the receiving end of that mistreatment, and makes it known that this is something that is an unacceptable situation.
Monique, do you think that a person that sees this happen would be wise to just go off and report it?
I think sometimes checking in first with that person who's on the receiving end, just to assess what they're comfortable with as well, just to make sure that, sometimes people like to stay under the radar, something they feel more comfortable with. But maybe if that's something they would like to report, you could find out that this is not an isolated incident. It could be something that this faculty member is known for doing. So it might be something that needs to be addressed on a bigger scale. But I would recommend checking in with the person who's on that receiving end first before you intercede on their behalf.
Got it. It makes a lot of sense.
And also I'd like to add, as you mentioned with African American hair, ethnic hair that is more highly textured, there's a lot of stigma with that when it comes to the workplace, whether their hair is in dreadlocks, afro textured hair. Sometimes there's a lot of perceptions about whether or not our hair is professional. And so there's an added layer of stigma that we sometimes have to face within the workplace. So that's another reason why touching someone's hair might be something that's offensive and problematic.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's take a look at the next one. My name is Abdi Salon, and I've been a nurse here for 5 years. Colleagues struggle with my name, so I've shortened it up to Abdi, but they still say they can't remember it or can't get it right. One faculty physician calls me Abraham, always with a chuckle. And recently, when a nurse named Hashem joined our staff, that physician said, "I'm sorry, I'll never keep these names straight. I'm just going to go with old Abraham and new Abraham." So what do you see going on here, Monique?
What I see going on here, first there's a level of disrespect, not calling someone by the name that they might prefer, making a name choice for them, what you decide to call them, and calling both of these colleagues by this name, old Abraham and new Abraham. This person has been working with the institution for 5 years, it says. So just really making that effort, with how long that they've been at the institution, to really acknowledge them and just make sure that you're using that correct name. If you do have a challenge with saying their name, maybe checking in with them to see what they would prefer. Sometimes people do have a nickname that they might go by, but let that be their choice.
So some of the things that a person might be able to do if they see this go on is, one thing you might say to Abdi in a situation like this is, hey, I want to make sure that I do get your name right. Can you help me make sure that I'm getting it right? You could say that right in front of this physician, right? That way you're not calling out the physician directly, you're not necessarily creating a confrontational situation, but you're modeling that behavior for that physician. You're letting Abdi know that you care about getting his name right. And it's validating in a number of ways like that. I think too often when we meet someone whose name is a little bit difficult for us to understand or pronounce, too often we might just ask once and say, how do you say your name? And the person says it, and we feel like we're automatically supposed to get it. But a lot of times we don't, right? The name might even have some phonemes that are not familiar to us, depending on what our primary language is. It may seem awkward, but it's usually really validating to the person you're talking to. Even if you need to ask them 2 or 3 times to say, can you please tell me again? I want to make sure I'm getting it right, and say it back to them. It may feel a little clunky, but it's really validating to that person that you are caring enough to get their name right. Because too often we either stop referring to folks by their name if we're not sure that we're going to be able to get it right, or sometimes people do what this physician did and assign some unwanted nickname that's supposedly funny, but really comes off as disrespectful and dehumanizing. Any other thoughts on that one, Monique, or should we move along to the next one?
Yes, I think just as you said, making sure that we're making that effort to try to understand the name that they would prefer to go by, and also just making sure that the burden isn't just always on them to correct someone. So when we kind of, many hands make light work. So when we're spreading out this work, when we're making sure that we're checking in with people and making their preferences known, that's also a way that we can be helpful and be upstanders.
It also wouldn't be inappropriate if someone felt comfortable to actually take that physician aside and say, hey, I noticed that you just assigned Abdi this nickname, and I don't think that's really coming off very well. It may be hard for someone to do that, depending on what their role is here, or whether they feel like they're on equal standing with that person. But that would certainly be an appropriate thing to do in most cases. But sometimes just asking Abdi directly in front of the physician, how do you like to be called? Can you say your name again? We'll do the trick. Let's take a look at our next one.
My parents are both from Uganda, and I was born in California while they were studying at UCLA. I've been a medical student here for 2 years now, and the other day a physician and I were being introduced to a patient. The patient took one look at me and said, "Where the hell are you from?" Before I had a chance to respond, the physician said, "No worries, she's from here. She's gone to good schools too." And that was that. We never discussed it further. How do you think that made me feel? So when you hear the situation, what are some of the things that are happening? What are some of the dynamics that are at play?
Yeah, there's a lot going on in this one too. And again, these are things that happen here. So it is not unusual for patients to be curious about us or ask where we're from. Sometimes it comes off in a very warm and genuinely curious way. This patient in particular, though, clearly this person's tone saying, where the hell are you from, is offensive, and intended to kind of be a little jarring towards this medical student. So there's that behavior from the patient. And then I think what happens here is, although intentions may have been good and likely were good on the part of the physician kind of gallops in on this horse to try to save the day. It ends up inadvertently making things worse, right? What the physician ends up really saying by reassuring the patient is like, whoa, whoa, she's one of the good ones. And the unspoken additional content there is, you're right, if she were from somewhere else, we'd have a problem, but she's from here. And then the additional line about she went to good schools too, as if that's a surprise that she went to good schools, is also insulting to the medical student. So there's a lot going on in this one, but clearly you can see how, it starts with the offensive question from the patient and then kind of the misguided attempt from the physician to help. And instead, he kind of throws some gasoline on the fire instead of water. So what do you think, how might this have been handled better, Monique?
Well, one thing you see, so we're not always going to get our upstander interventions right. And that's important to note. We're going to fumble sometimes, and that's all part of the process. It is important that we still try. So, but one of the things that they did get wrong is not checking in with the student who is on the receiving end of that treatment, because they could have checked in with them and then found out that, hey, this is a situation that I face on a regular basis. They might already have some responses kind of in their back pocket that they're used to kind of giving in this scenario. So maybe taking a pause for just a few seconds just to see if that student did have a response already, and then maybe trying to make your attempt to intercede. Also, the way that the physician was trying to make kind of qualifying statements about this person's identity. Yes, that they're from here, they went to good schools. And if there's someone who was in that situation who was from Uganda, who was born and raised there, you see how that could be something that could be hurtful to them. So yes, one of the most important things, making sure that they're checking in with the person who was on the receiving end of this. And just also just making sure that you're making that attempt to try, because if you're never trying to be an upstander because you think you're going to get it wrong, you're always going to end up being in that silent collusion. So that's, if you take away one thing from that scenario, just make sure that you understand that checking in with someone is always kind of a favorable thing to do.
I think we have one more for discussion, is that right?
Yes, correct.
Your department is seeking to fill several open positions, and you've agreed to serve on the hiring committee. During your first meeting, the chair of the committee says, "Wow, we finally got some diversity applicants, and some of them actually look halfway decent." What are your thoughts on this?
Well, when I hear this, one of the things that is striking to me is just the term diversity applicant within itself. That's something that can come off as really tokenizing. Sure, the goal for our institution and many institutions is to diversify our workforce. So, but in that process, not just marginalizing those applicants as a diversity applicant, where it makes it seem like their status is the only thing that is part of their qualifications. So making sure that we're, being kind of wary about using terminology like that. And then the second part of that is that they look halfway decent too, is implying that otherwise someone who might be a more diverse candidate isn't necessarily as qualified as the other candidates within a pool. We're also seeing that the person who is the chair is the person who is making this comment. And so that might also be a layer of this being an uncomfortable situation. And in some situations, someone might not want to speak to the chair about this, depending on that power dynamic. But we see that this is also a very critical situation where it is important to speak up in this incident before the process continues along. What are some of the possible ways you could intervene as well?
Yeah, I think how one might intervene in this, a lot of it depends just on their own interpersonal style and whether they're feeling brave in the moment, right? But a lot of times these committees will have folks from different ranks on and different job positions on them in these committees. And, hopefully somebody for whom there's not a huge power differential with the chair, hopefully someone in that situation would speak up and might say to the chair of the committee, like, "Whoa, I'm not comfortable with that." Could be really direct about it. I think virtually anybody on the committee would be able to maybe speak up and say, "What do you mean by what you just said?" And that just that direct, genuine question would lead the chair of that committee to have to reconsider what they just said and kind of speak those thoughts out loud. And in all likelihood, recognize the inappropriate nature of what they said and quite possibly apologize for it and kind of get back on track. It's always possible, of course, when you ask somebody what they meant by what they said, they might double down on it. That would be unfortunate, but at least you'd know where they stood with some things, right? And then you could have some additional discussion. But I think those are two really powerful approaches, is just stating that you're not comfortable with what was just said and or making the additional statement of And what did you mean by that? Oftentimes that's really helpful. These things can often lead to additional discussion, like you said, Monique, about the term diversity applicant. A lot of times additional discussion on hiring committees and search committees like this will lead to discussion of the fact that oftentimes there's this false dichotomy set up. Like, are we going to have diversity, or are we going to hire the best folks and have excellence? And that is completely a false dichotomy. Study after study shows that diversity and excellence are not separate choices to make, but that you really can't have excellence without having diversity. Time and time again, it's been shown that diverse groups make better decisions, make better products, and just overall perform better than non-diverse groups. And a happening like this at the start of this hiring and search committee meeting might lead to a fruitful discussion of those topics. I think we got a couple more slides where we want to talk to you just a bit more in summary about what you can do in order to intervene effectively when you see offensive behavior.
So these are some of the different techniques that you can kind of deploy to help diffuse these situations. So avoiding humor is important. And so while it might feel like a natural reaction to laugh or make a joke to make the situation feel a little less uncomfortable, laughter or humor may sometimes seem that it's reinforcing the comment or the action. So I know in previous iterations of this, we've kind of spoken about using humor, but it might not be as useful in some of these situations. As Dave said previously, asking the person to explain what they meant. So when you're asking someone to explain, you might have them, they might be clarifying this to themselves even. They might not really understand what they said until they repeat it. They say it out loud, and then they might realize that what they said might have been offensive, or they might double down on it. But then you are kind of helping clarify that situation. So that's an important tool to be able to use. Indicate that the situation is uncomfortable. So just kind of being able to take that onus off of the person who's on the receiving end of that treatment, acknowledging that the discomfort that is existing in that moment. Sometimes that can help kind of shift that moment as well. Avoid personal attacks. So call out their action or the impact of their action. Instead of saying you are being racist, instead try saying the way that you spoke to your nurse regarding her race is disrespectful and will not be tolerated at UIHC. Sometimes someone's defenses might go up as soon as they hear something like racism, homophobia, things like that. And so they become more defensive of themselves than they are being receptive. So also consider making the situation a teachable moment. Also, the person who was mistreated is not responsible for educating someone every time. By stepping in, you can reduce the burden on the person who was mistreated. So, and sometimes in that moment, the person might need to step away. It might be something that has been really uncomfortable and awkward for them. So don't necessarily try to make it a teachable moment in the sense of like bringing both parties together and making sure that they hash it out. That might not work the best in all the situations. If you need to step in, or you just need to talk to that person who received that mistreatment as an aside, just checking in with them can be very powerful in that moment. And so we also have some other items of ways that you can support that person as well.
Yeah, when you see things like this go down, you may consider saying something, right? We've talked about some of the things that you can say. We would encourage you to feel empowered to stand up against mistreatment. We are all responsible for making UIHC and our communities welcoming and inclusive. Like Monique said earlier, you know, many hands make light work. It's also more powerful when more of us get involved in stepping up when it's the right thing to do. If only one or two individuals in any group are always the ones to speak up about these sorts of things, it's really easy for people to start to tune them out, or maybe roll their eyes a little bit, or think, oh, there's so-and-so on their high horse, you know, talking about diversity again, right? When all of us take our turn and be supportive in this way, it really becomes far more powerful, and we don't get tuned out as much. Showing the person who was mistreated that you saw what happened can be incredibly powerful, supportive, and validating. Even if you have no idea what to do in the situation, just saying, whoa, I saw that. Would you like to talk about it? Are you doing okay? Anything along those lines is going to be so much better than just acting like you didn't see anything, because when when you don't say anything or don't validate the person's feelings, they're just left alone to wonder, you know, do people not care what happens to me? And do people not care to the degree that they don't even notice it happened? And that can be a really painful and isolating feeling. Allowing a person who was mistreated to speak up for themselves if they want to do that can be important too, right? In one of the scenarios where the patient asked the person, you know, where the hell are you from? That student may have wanted to respond themselves, but they never got the chance to. And so even just, you know, just waiting a breath or two to see if the person wants to speak up for themselves can be a powerful thing to do. And then being supportive after that. Allowing a person to remove themselves from the situation if they feel uncomfortable in the moment is important. And you can invite them to share their feelings later. Like Monique said previously, you know, trying to be heavy-handed about it and say, no, don't leave, come back. This person's going to apologize to you, and try to orchestrate a reconciliation is not going to work very well if what the offended person really needs to do is just get some space. So try to allow them that opportunity to remove themselves if they need that. Sometimes just asking a person what you can do to help is can be a very powerful intervention. And one of the things that we really like to remind people is try to focus on the feelings of the person who was mistreated rather than on your own feelings. I've made this mistake myself for sure, where I find out that I've offended somebody and then I apologize, but then I over apologize because I really want them to know how badly I feel and how I did not intend to hurt their feelings. And what ends up happening is somebody ends up apologizing for 5 minutes, the focus then becomes on them, and the dynamic shifts, and the person who was mistreated ends up having to like make the person who's apologizing feel better and say, oh, it wasn't that big a deal. The whole dynamic shifts. Or even if you're not the person that did the offensive behavior, if you go on and on about how distressed you were to see the person treated in that way, the focus shifts to being on you, and try not to do that. You can certainly say, whoa, I was really upset that I saw that, and would you like to talk about it? Or I'm so sorry that I offended you, I didn't mean to, would you like to talk about it? And then take your cues from that person. It's a really important thing to do.
And I'd also like to add that we do have a one-pager kind of PDF version of this that we can share with you. Feel free to contact our office if you'd like to have a resource like that for your department or area.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope that you'll feel empowered to stand up against mistreatment next time you see it.
If you have any additional questions, comments, or concerns, we're here for you. So feel free to contact the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Carver College of Medicine. Our email address is medicine-diversity@uiowa.edu, and our phone number is 319-384-2952. And like I said, we have a PDF version of some of the ways that you can support each other, and also additional talks and presentations that we can give as well.
We also want to acknowledge the contribution of our team members who contributed to the development of today's presentation, as shown here. And our office is led by Dr. Denise Martinez, Associate Dean in the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Thanks so much for your attention today.